At the gate of the town of Nain, we encounter two crowds, one going in and one coming out. The one going in is led by Jesus, the giver of life. The one going out is led by a dead man. What happens when these two crowds, these two processions, encounter one another? Jesus sees the grieving mother, and what does he do? How does he respond? His heart went out to her. He had compassion for her. He chose to share in her sorrow. Moved by compassion, Jesus acts. "Young man, I say to you, get up," he shouts. And the dead man sat up and began to talk. The compassion of Jesus led to something amazing happening, something unexpected. Death was trampled down by the Lord of life. This is our Christian hope. Through Jesus Christ, death, our ancient enemy, has been cast down and trampled underfoot. Death has been swallowed up in victory. We no longer have to live in fear of death. But sometimes we do anyway, don't we? It's difficult not to fear death. And I'm not just talking about physical death. We die many little deaths throughout our lives. Many of the changes we face feel much like a little death. We grieve the loss of the familiar. We long to relive the days of our past. A couple of examples of these little deaths. A little death would be last week I had to give up my beloved Explorer that was 12 years old and had 140,000 miles on it and was making some awful noises. It was time to get rid of it. So I traded it in on something newer. But that car that I had had for so long had become part of who I am. And it hurt to give it up. What hurt even more was I forgot the garage door opener on the visor, so I had to go back the next day and revisit my beloved Explorer for one last time. That was a little death. I had to let go of that truck. It served me well. I just really liked it. That's a little death. A big little death. 10 years ago, my father passed away after a long bout with leukemia. And it took me a long time before I quit saying, "Oh, I need to call Dad about this," and pick up the phone and realize there was no Dad to call. It took a while to get past that one, but eventually I did. That's a big little death. The reality is, if we are to continue to grow, if we're to continue to stay spiritually healthy, we have to accept these little deaths. We have to allow ourselves to be transformed into the full stature of Christ. And for that to happen, we have to let go of some of that baggage that we keep dragging around with us. Those old grudges, those past regrets, those character flaws. There are aspects of ourselves that we have to allow to die. In our epistle lesson, Paul speaks about his earlier life, about he was violently persecuting the church of God, trying to destroy the early Christian church. You may recall when our patron saint, Saint Stephen, when he was stoned to death, we're told that a young man by the name of Saul held the coats of those who were throwing the stones so they could throw them better. That young man who held those coats later on became Paul, the great missionary of the early Christian church. When Paul encountered Christ on the road to Damascus, he was transformed in a moment. But for that transformation to happen, another part of him had to die. The zealous persecutor of the church had to die. Congregations pass through these little deaths as well, if they are to be transformed and to continue to follow the call of God. I was an interim priest for a few years. I really kind of like being an interim priest. You're there for 1 year, you have 5 jobs to get done, you let them throw you a little party, and then you leave. That's it. No popularity contests, none of that stuff going on. It doesn't matter if you're a good preacher or a bad preacher. You got 5 jobs to do, they throw you a little party, and you leave. Yeah, when I retire, I'm probably going to do some interim work again. I kind of like that job. In terms of what they're supposed to be doing is they're supposed to be preparing the congregation for a new spiritual leader. Sometimes the former priest is the beloved rector. Other times the former priest is not quite so beloved. But in both situations, regardless, there is always a grieving process that's going on. And part of the job of the interim priest is to allow that grieving process to happen. It's important that it happens. And it's important that the interim priest shepherds that, meets the pastoral needs of those who are grieving. Because it's only when the congregation faces that particular chapter of their common life is over, that they accept that little death, that they can begin to dream about the future. There has to be a little death before there is room for new life. Sometimes we fear these little deaths so much that we're a bit too cautious. We hesitate to do anything new. We hesitate to do anything risky. What if we fail? What if there isn't enough? What if we make a mistake? We stick to the familiar, to the comfortable, because we're afraid of dying. Barbara Brown Taylor, an author and Episcopal priest, wrote a thoughtful article entitled "The Poured Out Church." Here's part of it. When I consider my life of faith, this world is clearly where my transformation has taken place. It is in the world that I have met the people who have changed me, some of them believers, but far more of them not. People who have loved me, fought me, shamed me, forgiven me, sanding down my edges on one side while they broke whole ragged chunks of me off the other. The world is where I have been struck dumb by beauty, by cruelty, by human invention and greed. The world is where my notions of God have been destroyed, reformed, chastened, redeemed. The world is where I have occasionally been good for something and where I have done great harm. The reason I know this, however, is that the church has given me the eyes with which I see, as well as the words with which I speak. The church has given me a community in which to figure out what has happened to me in the world. It has given me a place to love and grieve within a tradition far older and wiser than I. It is a church that has poured me into the world, in other words, which is counterintuitive. How can a church that has poured me into the world, how can the church keep pouring itself into the world? I cannot possibly say. All I know is the gospel truth. Those willing to give everything away are the ones with anything worth keeping. Those willing to look death full in the face are the ones with the most abundant lives. Go figure. Those willing to look death full in the face are the ones with the abundant lives. Can we look death full in the face? Are we willing to pour ourselves out into the world? Will we risk much for the sake of the gospel? We can, and we will, because we are Christians, because we do not live in fear of death, because we are those who proclaim the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, to be clear here, I'm not suggesting that we be foolish. There's a difference between being bold and risking much and being foolish. Of course, we're certainly called to be good stewards of the gifts that God has given us. But we need to always remember that our mission field is out there in the world. And to be effective witnesses for God, we must pour ourselves into the world. Even if it seems risky, even if it seems deadly. So how do we know where to pour ourselves out? In this morning's gospel, when those two processions met, one led by life, one led by death, it was at the moment that Jesus was filled with compassion for the widow that everything was transformed. Life overcame death. Mourning was transformed into laughter and joy. This transformation began with compassion, with Jesus opening his heart to the grief of the mother. Where do we begin to pour ourselves out? In those places where people are hurting. In those places where we find ourselves moved to open our hearts and reveal the compassion of Christ. We need to always remember that we do not exist for the sake of the church. We exist for the sake of the world. We are called to pour ourselves out, driven by compassion for those who are hurting in this world. If that means we have to look death in the face, so be it. Cannot God raise up something new from the ashes of our vanquished dreams? Let us not live in fear of death, or the little deaths that each of us will face. We walk together with Christ in our midst, so we need to be willing to risk much for the sake of the world and proclaim with our every word